May 12, 1968. The helicopters come in low over the Vietnamese rubber plantation, rotors thumping through humid air thick enough to taste. Dust swirls. Soldiers jump out carrying entrenching tools, ammunition, water. They have hours, maybe less, to turn this patch of contested jungle into something defensible. They don't know that 9 kilometers east, North Vietnamese Army commanders are already watching, already planning, already moving. By dawn, 11 Australians will be dead and the fire base they're standing in will be soaked in blood. But before you hear that story, I need you to do something. Hit that subscribe button right now for Vietnam War records. We bring you the untold battles, the real tactics, the stories that changed how men fought in the jungle. Subscribe, turn on notifications, because what you're about to hear happened only once in the entire war and you won't find this anywhere else. This is how Australian soldiers fought off 400 North Vietnamese regulars while their foxholes were still half dug, their wires still rolled up, their guns facing the wrong direction. This is Fire Support Base Coral. This is the night everything went wrong and somehow, impossibly, went right. The year is 1968 and the Vietnam War has reached a turning point. 3 months earlier, during the Tet Offensive, Communist forces attacked cities across South Vietnam in a coordinated assault that shocked the American public and shattered illusions about winning the war. By May, the North Vietnamese Army and Viet Cong are withdrawing from Saigon, bleeding, battered, but far from broken. American commanders want to capitalize on this moment. They want to catch the enemy in the open, destroy them before they can melt back into the jungle's sanctuaries. So they launch Operation Ton Thang, Complete Victory. 70,000 troops, American, South Vietnamese, Australian, New Zealand, Thai, sweeping through the provinces around Saigon like a dragnet. The Australians, based 60 kilometers southeast in Phuoc Thu Province, get orders to deploy north into Bien Hoa Province, into an area the Americans call the Catcher's Mitt. It's a killing ground, a crossroads of infiltration routes where North Vietnamese units move supplies and reinforcements toward the capital. The Australians have been in Vietnam since 1965, fighting a very different war than the Americans. While US forces conduct massive search and destroy operations, dropping bombs and artillery on suspected enemy locations, then moving on, the Australians practice counter-insurgency. They learnt it in Malaya, fighting communist guerrillas in the jungle for 12 years until they won. In Malaya, the Australians discovered that you don't just sweep through and leave, you patrol constantly. You dominate the ground. You set ambushes. You track the enemy. You make them afraid to move. And it works. In Phuoc Thu Province, the Australians have been so effective that Viet Cong documents warn cadres to avoid Australian areas of operation. They call the Australian SAS Ma Rung, phantoms of the jungle. Soldiers who move without sound, who appear from nowhere, who kill and vanish like smoke. But now in May 1968, the Australians are about to leave their carefully controlled province and step into something much bigger, much more dangerous. They're about to face not guerrillas but North Vietnamese Army regulars, trained soldiers with modern weapons, organized in battalions and regiments, fighting not as insurgents but as a conventional army. 1st Australian Task Force receives its orders on May 10th. 2 battalions, 1st RAR and 3rd RA and 3rd RA, plus artillery and support units, will helicopter into an area on the border of Bien Hoa and Long Can provinces. They'll establish a fire support patrol base, a fortified position from which they can launch patrols and provide artillery support. The base will be called Coral. The fly-in is scheduled for May 12th. The intelligence briefing is vague. The enemy is withdrawing from Saigon in small groups. The officers are told disorganized. Avoid contact. This assessment is catastrophically wrong. What the battalion commanders don't know, what headquarters somehow fails to tell them, is that intelligence has detected North Vietnamese 7th Division operating in the area. Not small groups, not demoralized stragglers, a full division. 3 regiments, thousands of soldiers, professional, determined, and very much looking for a fight. Lieutenant Colonel Philip Bennett commands 1st Battalion Royal Australian Regiment. On the morning of May 12th, he receives verbal orders for the operation. The written orders, the detailed plans that should outline every unit's position, every landing zone, every contingency, never arrive. He'll have to do this based on what he heard at the briefing and whatever develops on the ground. The helicopter insertion begins at 7 in the morning. Chinooks and Hueys ferry troops and equipment from the Australian base. The plan calls for an orderly sequence. B Company, 3rd RRA will land first and secure the landing zone. Then reconnaissance parties from the artillery, then the main body of infantry, then the guns. By early afternoon, everyone should be on the ground and starting to dig in. Within the first hour, the plan falls apart. As the lead helicopters approach the designated landing zone, an American company commander on the ground waves them off. His troops are in heavy contact with North Vietnamese forces just 3 kilometers away. Artillery is falling. Airstrikes are going in. The Australians divert to an alternate landing zone. Confusion spreads immediately. Units land at the wrong locations. Helicopter sorties are delayed. The artillery reconnaissance party, including Lieutenant Ian Ahern, gun position officer for 102 Field Battery, lands expecting to be met by the infantry security element. Instead, they find American troops who point vaguely into the rubber plantation and say some Australians went that way, into Indian country, unsecured. Major Brian Murtagh, the second-in-command of 12th Field Regiment, is supposed to be the fire support-based defense commander. He's supposed to coordinate wherever unit positions, where the guns go, where the infantry provides security. But when the reconnaissance party lands, Murtagh disappears. He walks off into the rubber plantation without telling anyone where he's going. Radio contact is lost. Meanwhile, the helicopters carrying the New Zealand artillery battery arrive early, 4 hours ahead of schedule, and there's no one to tell them where to land their guns. The gun position officer for 102 Battery, Ian Ahern, finally gets Murtagh on the radio and asks for his location. Murtagh says he's just up the track, but there are tracks everywhere in this old rubber plantation. Ahern asks him to pop smoke so he can find him. Murtagh throws a smoke grenade. Ahern takes a compass bearing on the colored smoke and walks toward them through the rubber trees with 2 other soldiers. What they find, about 1,500 meters from the landing zone, horrifies them. Weapon pits, freshly dug. Circular fighting positions, perhaps 100 of them, arranged in a tactical pattern. The dirt is still damp. There's an AK-47 round on the ground, a candy wrapper with Ho Chi Minh. An enemy force, a large enemy force, rested here recently. Maybe this morning. Ahern reports this to Murtagh. Murtagh acknowledges it and does nothing. He doesn't report it up the chain. He doesn't alter the defense plan. He doesn't warn the other units. He simply designates where the artillery will go and continues with the deployment. Throughout the day, the fly-in continues in chaos. Units arrive hours late. Companies land at wrong locations and spend the afternoon trying to figure out where they are. The artillery lands before the infantry that's supposed to protect them. At one point, Captain David Brooke, the battery captain for 102 Battery, is dropped alone in the middle of an open, grassy area and left there for over an hour with no security. As the day wears on, soldiers begin to notice things. American troops at the landing zone are nervous, jumpy. Their commander, before he leaves with his unit, stops and tells some Australians, "You won't need to find Charlie. They'll come looking for you." Out beyond the perimeter, soldiers on patrol see D Company, 1st RR, spots North Vietnamese and kills one. B Company fires at enemy troops but misses. Then, as dusk approaches, the soldiers see signal flares, answered by other red flares from different locations, and green tracer fire shot vertically into the air. Green tracer. The Allies use red tracer. Only the North Vietnamese use green. The enemy is out close, communicating, coordinating, preparing. As darkness falls, the situation at Fire Support Base Coral is a tactical nightmare. The base isn't a base. It's 2 separate clusters of units, separated by 1,500 meters of open ground. Around the New Zealand Battery, 161 Field Battery, there's 1 platoon of infantry for protection. Around the Australian Battery, 102 Field Battery, there's supposed to be a company of infantry, but they're positioned too far away to provide effective defense. The mortars from 1st RAR arrive last, just before dark, and they're placed right on the perimeter alongside the guns. In a properly organized firebase, infantry forms the outer perimeter. Artillery and mortars stay behind them, protected. Here, the gunners and mortarmen are the perimeter. They are the only thing between the jungle and the command posts. 1st RA's headquarters, instead of moving out to join one of the rifle companies as planned, stays at Coral with 2 platoons, anti-tank platoon and assault pioneer platoon. These are specialists, not infantry trained for perimeter defense. There is no coordinated defense plan. Major Murtagh, the defense commander, never calls an orders group. He never gathers the unit commanders and says, "This is your sector, this is your responsibility, these are your mutual support positions." The mortar platoon officer, Lieutenant Tony Jensen, tries to coordinate his machine gun arcs with the battery. The gunners try to tie in their positions. But there's no overall plan. No claymore mines are put out because nobody knows where D Company, 3rd RA is supposed to be, and they don't want to blow up friendly troops. No barbed wire is erected because it arrives late and there's no time. Some soldiers dig weapon pits 4 feet deep. Others, including most of the artillery, dig shell scrapes 15 centimeters deep, barely enough to cover a man lying flat. It rains heavily at dusk, a brief tropical downpour. Every shell scrape fills with water and mud. Weapons get muddy. Later, during the battle, this mud will cause machine guns to jam at the worst possible moment. 102 Battery has 6 howitzers, big M2A 2105mm guns, arranged in a line facing east. A bulldozer manages to push up protective earth buns around 3 of them. Guns 4, 5, and 6 on the northern end, before darkness stops the work. Guns 1, 2, and 3 on the southern end have no protection. At last light, the standard practice is to stand to. Everyone stops working, takes up weapons, and watches their front in silence. It's an infantry practice designed to prevent surprise at the vulnerable twilight hours. But at Coral, the artillery is still adjusting defensive fire missions for the rifle companies out in the bush, so the howitzers are firing, booming through the dusk, and nobody is standing silent at all. The bulldozer stops, the wire stays rolled, the claymores stay in their bags, and as full darkness comes, most soldiers crawl into their muddy shell scrapes and try to rest. Only the machine gun sentries stay awake, peering into the blackness beyond the perimeter. At midnight, the mortar platoon machine gunner sees movement and opens fire. 3 North Vietnamese soldiers at the edge of the position. The regimental command post accuses Jensen of firing at them. Jensen radios back, "I've only got red tracer and that's green." Stand down is called. Most men go back to sleep. What none of them know, what they cannot see in the darkness and rain, is that 250 meters away, a battalion of North Vietnamese soldiers is digging in. 400 men. Soldiers from the 141 Regiment, 7th NEA Division, augmented by infiltration groups, lie in fighting positions they've quietly scraped out of the earth. They've been watching the Australians all day. They've seen the helicopters coming and going, seen the confusion, seen the incomplete attack tonight. Before the Australians are ready, before they can dig in properly. Hit them hard, overrun the artillery, kill as many as possible, and withdraw before dawn. At 2:15 in the morning, 2 men in D Company 1st RAR, on ambush position 2,000 meters north of the firebase, see a large group of enemy moving southwest. The platoon machine gunner opens fire. The response is instant. A salvo of RPG rockets explodes in the trees above the platoon. RPG-7s, Soviet-made rocket-propelled grenades, detonating in the canopy and showering the men below with shrapnel and splintered wood. In seconds, 11 of the platoon's 30 men are casualties. The forward observer, 2nd Lieutenant Gordon Alexander, radios frantically for fire support. At 102 Battery, 1,500 meters south, the tannoy speaker suddenly roars to life. "Contact! Contact! Fire mission battery!" Soldiers tumble out of their shell scrapes and run to the guns. The shells arc out into the darkness. Alexander adjusts the fall of the mission lasts 20 minutes. End of mission. Target neutralized. The gunners clean up around the gun platforms, pick up shell casings, make notes. Most go back to sleep. But the battery commander, Major Gavin Andrews, is worried. He calls for the gun position officer, Ian Ahern. When Ahern arrives at the command post, Andrews asks, "Can we handle 2 final protective fire tasks simultaneously?" Final protective fire is the last-ditch defensive fire, pre-plotted targets that can be fired immediately if a position is about to be overrun. Having 2 FPF tasks means splitting the battery. Ahern says yes. They agree to lay guns 1, 2, and 3 facing east toward B Company's area. Guns 4, 5, and 6 will face north toward D Company's area, loaded, laid on their targets, ready to fire instantly. This decision, made in the darkness by worried officers, will save lives in minutes. At 2:30 in the morning, the world explodes. Rocket-propelled grenades streak out of the darkness. 8, 10, a dozen trails of fire arcing towards the Australian positions. Mortar rounds crump into the earth. Machine gun fire, the distinctive crack of AK-47s, rips through the air. The heaviest concentration of fire falls on the mortar platoon and 102 Battery. For 5 minutes the bombardment is relentless. Men press themselves into their shallow scrapes. Dirt and shrapnel rain down. The noise is overwhelming, a physical pressure on the eardrums. 10 minutes of eerie quiet. Soldiers strain their eyes into They hear sounds, movement, the click of weapons. Then signal flares pop into the sky, green and red stars hanging over the battlefield, and the North Vietnamese attack. Gunners Mick Grimes and John Schwartz are manning the M60 machine gun in front of gun number 6 when they see it. Out of the darkness, no more than 150 meters away, massed ranks of infantry simply stand up and come forward. Not rushing, walking, long straight lines of men, 100, 200, perhaps more, moving with discipline toward the Australian positions. Grimes and Schwarzer open fire. The M60 hammers out rounds, tracer lacing into the advancing enemy. Men fall, but the lines keep coming. Then the machine gun jams. Grimes clears it. Fires again. It jams a second time. Clears it. Fires. Jams a third time. They abandon the gun and fall back to the gun position. The North Vietnamese follow them right up onto the protective earthbund. At the mortar platoon, Lieutenant Tony Jensen hears one of his soldiers shout, "There are about 400 MOGs about 50 yards away." Jensen knows instantly that his 18-man platoon is about to be annihilated. The enemy is already at the perimeter. The mortars are pointed east. There's no time to traverse them. Jensen shouts for his men to fire the mortars at maximum elevation, straight up so the rounds will fall almost vertically, but even as he gives the order, he knows it's too late. The North Vietnamese are in among the positions. He sees an enemy soldier fire an RPG into a shell scrape he'd occupied moments before. The grenade explodes. Jensen's backpack disintegrates. He would have been in that hole, would have been vaporized. His men are fighting at point-blank range now. 2 soldiers try to dash from one position to another and are cut down instantly. Killed. Jensen realizes with cold clarity that if he doesn't do something radical, everyone in the platoon will die in the next 60 seconds. He makes a decision that will haunt him and save his men's lives. He radios the anti-tank platoon, 300 meters away, and calls for Splintex fire on his own position. Splintex. 90mm recoilless rifle rounds loaded with more than 7,000 steel flechettes, razor-sharp darts designed to shred everything above ground. He's calling artillery on himself, on his own men. He shouts to his platoon, "Stay down! Splintex coming in." Then he gives the fire order. The 90mm guns boom. The rounds shriek overhead and detonate. Thousands of flechettes scythe across the mortar position at supersonic speed with a sound like tearing fabric amplified 1,000 times. Everything above ground ceases to exist. The North Vietnamese caught in the open are shredded. Australians in their weapon pits, covered in mud and terror, survive. When the darts stop, Jensen lifts his head. The attack on the mortar platoon has faltered. Bodies lie torn apart. The survivors have pulled back. But the cost is terrible. 5 of his 18 men are dead. 8 more are wounded. Only 5 are still combat effective, and the battle is just beginning. At 102 Battery, the fight is even more desperate. The North Vietnamese have studied the Australian positions during the day. They noted that the howitzers were facing east, so they attacked from the north, expecting the guns to be pointed away, expecting the gunners to have no time to react, but those guns have been relayed. When the infantry assault comes in from the north, guns 4, 5, and 6 are already aimed directly at them. The gunners don't hesitate. They fire over open sights, point-blank artillery. The 105mm howitzers are designed to fire shells 10 kilometers. Here, they're firing at targets 100 meters away. The high-explosive rounds detonate among the advancing North Vietnamese with apocalyptic force. Bodies are hurled through the air. Entire sections of the assault wave disintegrate, but the enemy keeps coming. Bombardier Andy Forsdyke is lying with his M60 machine gun team 20 meters in front of the battery when the assault begins. Suddenly, "VC get up from all around us," he'll write later. "They had crawled up to within 4 feet of the M60, and we did not even know they were there." Forsdyke's team opens fire. The enemy fires back, wildly, holding their AK-47s above their heads and spraying bullets. The machine gun jams. Forsdyke frantically clears it. Behind them, they hear yelling from the mortar. Australian voices screaming, "They have got us." Forsdyke's team wants to help, but there are too many enemy between them and the mortars. They fire at the VC on the track. Later, Forsdyke will realize they probably hit the two Australian mortar men. In the chaos, with fire coming from every direction, they couldn't tell friend from enemy. Several of Forsdyke's team are hit. The machine gun jams again. They fall back to the gun position. The North Vietnamese are among the howitzers now. Gun number 6, the northernmost gun, is overrun. The crew fights hand to hand. Second Lieutenant Matt Cleland, the section commander, empties his pistol at North Vietnamese soldiers on top of the gun's protective bund, then sprints to his weapon pit to grab his F1 submachine gun. The gunners drop their M60 machine gun in the confusion. Gun Sergeant Max Franklin, seeing the position is lost, makes a crucial decision. He grabs the howitzer's firing pin and takes it with him as the crew abandons the gun. Without the firing pin, the weapon is useless. Even if the enemy captures it, they can't fire it. In the darkness and noise, no one thinks to tell the officers about this. For the next hour, the Australians will believe the enemy has a functional howitzer that could be turned on them at any moment. The gun crew falls back to gun number 5. Grenades are exploding. The North Vietnamese are hurling stick grenades and Chicom grenades into the Australian positions. The Australians have no grenades to throw back. Regimental policy prohibits the men from carrying grenades after an accidental death at Nui Dat, so they fight with rifles and machine guns in their bare hands. Gun number 4, the crew that stayed awake drinking coffee instead of sleeping, sees the enemy coming and opens withering small arms fire. The protective earth bund in front of their position saves them. The enemy fire hits the bund and stops. The Australians fire back, disciplined, controlled, and the North Vietnamese in front of gun 4 cannot advance. At the regimental command post between the mortars and the guns, Lance Bombardier Andy Forsdyke has made it back and is now defending the CP with a small group. They're firing at enemy soldiers they can see moving between the gun positions. Radio operator signals are going out. American helicopter gunships are inbound. A C-47 spooky gunship is overhead, dropping flares that turn night into flickering day, and firing its miniguns, electric Gatling guns that pour 6,000 rounds per minute into the rubber plantation. The tracer streams look like glowing fingers reaching down from the sky. But the North Vietnamese are professionals. They press the attack. Small groups try to work around the flanks of the battery. 102 Battery's command post comes under fire. Captain David Brooke and Lieutenant Ian Ahern, the senior officers, realize that gun number 6 is still in enemy hands. They gather a small group, arm themselves with grenades, American M26 fragmentation grenades scrounged from somewhere, and assault the gun position. They clear the area around the gun in brutal close-quarters fighting. Small arms fire at 5-meter range. When it's done, they've recaptured the gun. But the cost in lives and blood is staggering. To the north, 2,000 meters away, D Company 1st Ra is watching all of this and can do nothing. From their ambush position, Gordon Alexander, the forward observer, can see the battle at the firebase. Tracer fire in all directions, explosions, flares. He radios the firebase to call in a fire mission. The reply comes back from Ian Ahern, flat and tense. This call sign is underground assault. Alexander can only respond, "Oh, there's nothing he can do. His company is too far away. They can only watch and hope." All across the area around Coral, the Australian rifle companies are out in ambush positions, dispersed, unable to reinforce the firebase. That's what the North Vietnamese planned. Hit the artillery when it's isolated. Destroy the guns. Kill the gunners. Withdraw before the infantry can react. But the plan is failing. By 4:30 in the morning, the main enemy attack begins to falter. The North Vietnamese have suffered devastating casualties. Artillery firing over open sights has torn apart their assault waves. The Splintex rounds have scythed down whole groups. The helicopter gunships the spooky gunship has poured fire into their withdrawal routes. And the Australians, trapped in shallow holes, outnumbered, underprepared, have fought with a ferocity the enemy didn't expect. The North Vietnamese begin to withdraw into the rubber plantation to the northeast. They take as many of their dead and wounded as they can carry. Small rearguard parties stay behind, sniping, covering the retreat. Sporadic attacks continue until dawn, but they're broken up by concentrated fire. At 6:10 in the morning, Australian soldiers find and kill the last North Vietnamese soldier still fighting in the number 6 gun emplacement. Then, silence. The kind of silence that comes after violence, ringing and fragile. As dawn breaks over fire support base Coral, the survivors begin to assess what's happened. 11 Australian soldiers are dead, 28 are wounded. The mortar platoon has been devastated. 5 killed and 8 wounded. From the dead are mostly young. 6 are regular army soldiers, career men who chose this life. 5 are national servicemen, conscripts, boys who'd been drafted and sent to war. Their average age is 22 years. Around the perimeter, 52 North Vietnamese bodies lie where they fell. Some are torn apart by artillery. Some are riddled with machine gun fire. Some are shredded by splintex, barely recognizable as human. The Australians have also captured 1 North Vietnamese soldier alive, wounded, and numerous weapons. AK-47s, RPG launchers, machine guns, 23 small arms, 7 crew-served weapons. 1 howitzer was briefly captured but then recaptured. 2 mortars are damaged. The soldiers begin the grim work of burying the enemy dead. They dig a mass grave near gun number 6 and place the bodies inside. It's a necessary but terrible task. Some of the enemy dead are just boys too, 16, 17 years old. Later that day, Lieutenant Colonel Philip Bennett, commanding 1st RR, sends a message to all units involved in the battle. He commends their steadiness and bravery. He notes that an enemy battalion has been severely mauled. Our losses, he writes, have more than been accounted for, but the questions remain. How did this happen? Why were the Australians caught so unprepared? The intelligence was that senior commanders knew that North Vietnamese Divisional Strength Forces were operating in the area, but that intelligence never reached the battalion commanders. They were told to expect small groups of demoralized Viet Cong withdrawing from Saigon. Instead, they encountered a well-organized, aggressive, battalion-strength assault by regular NEA troops. The deployment was chaotic. Units landed at wrong locations. Artillery was inserted before infantry protection. The defense plan: no coordinated orders, no mutual support between units. Defenses incomplete. No wire, no mines. Insufficient digging. And the positioning was fatally flawed. The mortars and artillery were on the perimeter, not protected behind infantry. If the enemy had rushed the positions without the preparatory bombardment that gave warning, the outcome might have been catastrophic. The Australians might have been overrun entirely. But they weren't. Why? Because when everything went wrong, individual soldiers and junior leaders made it right. Lieutenant Tony Jensen calling splintex fire on his own position. Gun Sergeant Max Franklin taking the firing pin. Gunners Grimes and Schwarzer falling back but still fighting. Lieutenant Ian Ahern and Captain David Brooke assaulting a captured gun position with grenades. Soldiers in shallow holes refusing to break even when the enemy was on. That's what saved Coral. Not brilliant planning. Not overwhelming firepower. Individual courage. The battle for fire support base Coral doesn't end on May 13th. It continues for almost 4 weeks. The North Vietnamese attack again on May 16th. This time hitting both Coral and a new fire base called Balmoral, 6 kilometers to the north. Again, the Australians repel the attacks, this time with support from Centurion tanks from 1st Armoured Regiment. The big tanks, 52-ton beasts armed with 84mm guns, proved devastatingly effective in the jungle. On May 26, the enemy hits Balmoral with a battalion-sized assault. The Centurions anchor the defense. Their armor is impervious to RPG fire. Their guns tear apart enemy positions. One Australian soldier later says that when the Centurions opened fire, it was like someone turned on a light switch. The enemy just stopped. The last major attack comes on May 28th. Again, by the time the Battle of Coral Balmoral ends on June 6th, the Australians have killed more than 300 North Vietnamese soldiers. They've faced the 141 and 165 regiments of 7th NVA Division in sustained combat. They've proven they can fight and win against regular NVA troops. But the cost is high. 26 Australian soldiers dead. Over 100 wounded. It's the largest and most sustained battle the Australians fight in Vietnam. Radio Hanoi claims a great victory for the 141 Regiment. They say they destroyed an Australian firebase and inflicted heavy casualties. It's propaganda, but it's not entirely false. The North Vietnamese did overrun parts of the position. They did kill and wound Australians. They just didn't win. The Australian official history of the war will later be criticised by veterans for inaccuracies in describing the battle. Lieutenant Ian Ahern, who was there, who fought through that night, will spend years trying to correct the record. He'll write detailed accounts. He'll interview other survivors. He'll document what actually happened, because getting the history right matters. Not for glory, but because future soldiers need to learn the real lessons: what worked, what failed, what saved lives and what cost lives. One of the most controversial aspects is the intelligence failure. Did headquarters know about the enemy strength and fail to pass it on? Or did they genuinely not know? The evidence suggests they knew. Intelligence reports mentioned divisional strength forces, but somehow that information didn't reach the battalion commanders in actionable form. There was a breakdown in the intelligence chain, and soldiers died because of the Australian way of fighting in Vietnam was fundamentally different from the American approach. The Americans fought a war of attrition and firepower, search and destroy, massive helicopter assaults, artillery barrages, B-52 strikes. The goal was to kill so many enemy soldiers that the North Vietnamese would give up. The problem was that the North Vietnamese were willing to accept staggering casualties. They had more soldiers than the Americans had bullets. The Australians learned a different lesson in Malaya. From 1948 to 1960, they fought communist guerrillas in the Malayan jungle. It was a long, grinding counter-insurgency campaign. The Australians learned that you don't win by killing. You win by controlling territory and separating the guerrillas from the population. You win by constant patrolling, by dominating the ground, by making the enemy afraid to move. You win by patience and persistence. When the Australians deployed to Vietnam, they brought those lessons with them. They established fire support patrol bases, not just fire support bases. The word patrol was crucial. It meant the base was a hub for constant patrolling, not just a firing position for artillery. Australian infantry companies would patrol aggressively around their area of operations. They'd set ambushes. They'd track the enemy. They'd learn the ground intimately. And they'd stay. They'd hold the territory. The Americans would sweep through an area, fight a battle, and leave. The Viet Cong would return the next day. The Australians would sweep through an area and stay there, patrolling, ambushing, making it impossible for the enemy to operate. It was a different philosophy, a different way of thinking about the war. Phuoc Tue province, where the Australians based their task force, became one of the more secure provinces in South Vietnam, not because of massive firepower, because of persistent presence. The Australian SAS took this approach even further. They conducted long-range reconnaissance patrols deep into enemy territory. 5 or 6 men, moving silently through the jungle for days or weeks. They'd observe enemy movements, call in airstrikes, set ambushes, then vanish before the enemy could react. The North Vietnamese came to fear them. They gave them a nickname, Ma Rung, Phantoms of the Jungle. In captured documents, Viet Cong commanders warned their troops to avoid areas where the Australian SAS operated. The SAS had a different mentality from conventional troops. They didn't want to fight big battles. They wanted to control the enemy's movements, to make him afraid, to never let him rest. One SAS patrol in 1969, led by Sergeant Jim McLeod, stayed in the jungle for 10 days, an almost impossible feat. They survived by moving constantly, never staying in one position, never making noise, becoming part of the jungle. The North Vietnamese tried to track them, tried to trap them, failed. When the patrol finally extracted enemy documents found later showed the NVA had committed hundreds of soldiers trying to find those 5 or 6 Australians. That's asymmetric warfare. That's what the SAS did. They made the enemy expend enormous resources chasing ghosts. American Special Operations Forces, particularly the Navy SEALs, trained with the Australian SAS and learned from them. The Australians taught them counter-tracking, how to move through jungle without leaving sign, how to set up a patrol base that was virtually invisible. Some American units adopted Australian tactics, but the overall American strategy remained focused on firepower and attrition. There were good reasons for this. The American military was structured for conventional war. Its doctrine, its training, its equipment, all optimized for fighting large-scale battles with massive support, tanks, artillery, air power. Trying to retrain an entire army for counterinsurgency warfare in the middle of a war is almost impossible. So the Americans fought the way they knew how, with the tools they had, and it wasn't entirely unsuccessful. American forces won almost. They killed tens of thousands of enemy soldiers, but they couldn't translate battlefield victories into strategic success because the North Vietnamese weren't trying to win battles. They were trying to outlast the Americans, to make the war so long, so costly, so painful that the American public would demand withdrawal. And that strategy worked. By 1968, American public opinion had turned against the war. The Tet Offensive, though a military defeat for the Communists, was a psychological victory. It proved the war was nowhere near over. It proved the enemy could still, and it shattered the credibility of American commanders who had been saying the war was being won. The Australians faced a different challenge. They weren't trying to win the war. They couldn't. Their force was too small. At peak strength, the 1st Australian Task Force had about 8,000 soldiers. Compare that to over 500,000 Americans in Vietnam. The Australians' mission was more limited. Secure Phu Tuy province, support the Americans. Demonstrate Australia's commitment as an ally. And within those narrow parameters, they succeeded. But Coral showed the limits of that success. When the Australians left their carefully controlled province and went into contested territory, they faced a much more dangerous enemy. They adapted, they fought, they won. But it was close. If not for individual acts of courage, if not for the lucky repositioning of those howitzers, if not for decisions made in the heat of battle by junior officers and NCOs, Coral could have been a disaster. That's the reality of war. Plans fail, things go wrong, and survival often comes down to luck and individual. The men who fought at Coral understood this. They didn't feel like heroes. They felt like survivors. Later, when the medals came, when the battle honors were awarded, many of them felt uncomfortable with the attention. They remembered the friends who died. They remembered the fear. They remembered how close it came. 11 dead, 28 wounded. In the grand scale of the Vietnam War, the Americans lost 58,000. The Vietnamese, North and South, lost millions. But for the men who were there, for the families who lost sons and husbands and fathers, those 11 deaths were not small. They were everything. What did the North Vietnamese think? We know some of what they thought, because after the war, Vietnamese historians and veterans wrote about these battles. They acknowledged the Australians were formidable opponents. Skilled, aggressive, difficult to surprise. One North Vietnamese after-action report noted that the Australians reacted to ambushes differently than the Americans. Americans would often take cover and call for air support and artillery. Australians would assault directly into the ambush, trying to close with the enemy before they could escape. It's a risky tactic, but it's effective if your soldiers are well-trained and disciplined. The North Vietnamese also noted that Australian artillery was exceptionally accurate and responsive. Forward observers embedded with infantry companies could call fire missions and have shells landing in minutes. The coordination between infantry and artillery was seamless. At Coral, that coordination saved lives. When Lieutenant Gordon Alexander called for fire support for his ambushed platoon at 2:15 in the morning, 102 Battery was firing within minutes. That kind of responsiveness is the result of training and practice. The gunners knew their jobs. The forward observers knew how to call a mission. The system worked even under extreme pressure. But the North Vietnamese also learned from Coral. They learned that attacking Australian positions was costly. They learned that Australian soldiers would fight desperately when cornered. And they learned that even when initial attacks succeeded, the Australians would counterattack immediately. After Coral, North Vietnamese commanders were more cautious about engaging Australian forces directly. They preferred to avoid Australian areas of operation when possible. That's a form of victory. When the enemy doesn't want to fight you, you've won a psychological advantage. Lieutenant Tony Jensen, who called Splintex fire on his own position, carried the weight of that decision for decades. He saved most of his platoon, but 5 men died and 8 were wounded. Could he have done something different? Should he have ordered a retreat? Should he have tried to fight it out with small arms? These questions haunted him. In 2020, 52 years after the battle, Tony Jensen was awarded the Medal of Gallantry for his actions that night. The citation noted his extraordinary courage and leadership under extreme pressure. For Jensen, the medal was bittersweet. He appreciated the recognition, but he never forgot the men who— That's the burden of leadership in combat. You make decisions in seconds that you'll— Lieutenant Ian Ahern, the gun position officer who helped recapture the overrun howitzer, spent years documenting the battle. He wrote detailed accounts. He corrected errors in the official history. He fought to get recognition for his soldiers. In his writing, you can feel his frustration with the failures of planning and command that put his men in danger. But you can also feel his pride in how they responded. They were given an impossible situation and they survived it. Not because of perfect tactics or brilliant strategy, because they refused. Gun Sergeant Max Franklin, who took the firing pin from the captured howitzer, probably prevented the North Vietnamese from turning that gun on the Australians. It was a small decision made in the chaos of combat, but it mattered. That's what Ahern wanted people to understand. War is made up of thousands of small decisions. Most of the men who made them never got medals. But They mattered. Fire support base Coral remained operational for several more weeks after the initial attack. The Australians reinforced the position. They dug proper bunkers, they strung barbed wire, they positioned the units correctly with infantry on the perimeter and artillery, but they learned from their mistakes. And when the North Vietnamese attacked again on May 16th, the defences held with far fewer casualties. Balmoral, the second fire base, was established on May 24th and immediately attacked on May 26th. This time, the Australians were ready. They had Centurion tanks dug in as mobile pillboxes. They had proper coordination between infantry and armor and artillery. The enemy attack was broken up before it reached the perimeter. It was a textbook, but it only looked textbook because they'd learned the hard lessons at Coral. That's how military organizations improve, through experience, through failure, through the blood of soldiers who pay for those lessons. The Battle of Coral Balmoral became one of 5 battle honours awarded to Australian units for the Vietnam War. A battle honour is a recognition that a unit distinguished itself in a particular. It's carried on the unit's colours and remembered in its history. For the soldiers of 1st RA, 3rd RA, 102 Field Battery, and the other units involved, the battle honour Coral is a mark of pride. But it's also a reminder of the 11 men who didn't come home. The wider context of 1968 is important to understand. This was the year the war reached its peak intensity and also began its long decline. The Tet Offensive in January and February shocked the American public. President Lyndon Johnson announced he wouldn't seek re-election. Peace talks began in Paris, but the fighting didn't stop. In fact, some of the heaviest fighting of the entire war occurred in 1968. Khe Sanh, Saigon, Coral, and Balmoral. The North Vietnamese and Viet Cong launched major attacks, trying to achieve military victories that could strengthen their negotiating position. The Americans and their allies fought to prove they could still win on the battlefield. Both sides suffered enormous casualties. Neither side achieved a decisive victory. It was a year of attrition, of grinding combat, of small battles that mattered enormously to the men fighting them but changed nothing strategically. For the Australians, 1968 marked a shift. Before Coral, they'd mostly fought Viet Cong guerrillas in Phuoc Thu province. After Coral, they faced regular North Vietnamese Army units in sustained combat. It was a different war, more intense, more dangerous. The enemy was better armed, better trained, more willing to stand and fight. The Australians adapted. They proved they could fight conventional battles as well as counter-insurgency operations. More casualties, more strain on the small Australian force, and back home in Australia, public opinion was turning against the war just as it was in America. The conscription system national service became increasingly controversial. Young men were being drafted by birthday ballot and sent to fight in a war many Australians didn't support. The men who fought, whether volunteers or conscripts, found themselves caught between duty and politics. They did their jobs. They fought with courage. And when they came home, many found a public that didn't want to hear about it. The legacy of Coral is complex. Militarily, it demonstrated the quality. They faced a numerically superior enemy in a badly organized position and won. That's remarkable. But it also demonstrated failures in planning, intelligence, and command. The Australians shouldn't have been in that position in the first place. The deployment was rushed. The intelligence was inadequate. The defense was poorly coordinated. Soldiers paid for those mistakes with their lives. For the veterans, Coral represents both the best and worst of their war. The best, the courage, the mateship, the refusal to give up. The worst, the mistakes that made their courage necessary. Many veterans of Coral struggled with what they experienced. Post-traumatic stress, we call it now. Survivor's guilt, the question of why they lived and their friends died. For decades, many didn't talk about it, kept it locked away. It was only later, when historians and researchers began documenting the battle, that some veterans started to open up, to tell their stories, to make sure the truth was recorded. For the families of the 11 men who died at Coral, the battle is more than history. It's personal. Several of the dead were just 20 years old. They'd barely started their adult. Some had girlfriends, some had young wives, some had children they'd never see grow up. Their names are recorded on the Australian War Memorial in Canberra. Private Keith Thomas Dexter, Private Michael Charles Hankett, Lance Corporal Rodney Maxwell Kavanagh, Private Noel George Lloyd, Corporal Edward Patrick McAloney, Private John Warwick Prentice, Private Dennis Arthur Rayner, Private Dennis Joseph Salveron, Lance Corporal Donald Edward Thompson, Lance Corporal John Lawrence Walker, Private Bruce Allen Wilson. 11 names among more than 500 Australians killed in Vietnam. Each one represents a family that received the worst news possible. Each one represents a life cut short, a future erased. The broader question is whether the Vietnam War itself was worth fighting. That debate continues. For the soldiers who fought at Coral, the question was more they didn't make policy, they followed orders. They did their duty, as they understood it, and when the enemy attacked, they fought not for ideology or politics, but for survival and for the men beside them. That's the reality of combat. The big questions fade away. You fight for your mates. You fight to live. Everything else is distant and abstract. The Australian government eventually ended its involvement in Vietnam. The last combat troops withdrew in 1971. 2 years later, Saigon fell to North Vietnamese forces, and the war ended in communist victory. Everything the Australians and Americans fought for, all the sacrifices, seemed wasted. South Vietnam ceased to exist. The communists reunified the country under their control. For veterans, this was a bitter pill. They'd risked their lives, seen friends die, endured trauma, and for what? A defeat, an ally abandoned, a war lost. It took decades for Australian society to properly recognize Vietnam veterans, to acknowledge what they went through, to separate the warriors from the war. The men who fought at Coral deserved honor, regardless of whether the war itself was just or wise. They did what their country asked them to do. They did it with courage. That deserves respect. Today, fire support base Coral is farmland. The jungle has reclaimed much of it. The weapon pits are gone. The gun positions filled in. There's a memorial erected by Vietnamese and Australian veterans working together. It's a small plaque marking where the battle occurred, where men fought and died on a May night in 1968. If you stand there today, you can hardly imagine the violence that erupted in that, the crack of rifles, the screams of wounded men, the fear and courage of soldiers fighting in the darkness. But it was real, and the men who survived it, the men who died there, deserve to be remembered, not as propaganda, not as political symbols, but as human beings who faced something terrible and did their best. The tactical lessons from Coral have been studied by military institutions around the world. How to rapidly establish a defensive position, the importance of the danger of underestimating enemy capabilities, the need for... These lessons are written in doctrinal manuals, taught at staff colleges, applied in subsequent conflicts. But the deeper lesson is harder to quantify, that when plans fail, individual courage and initiative can make the difference between disaster and survival. The junior leaders, sergeants and lieutenants, are the most important people on the battlefield because they make decisions in the moment that no amount of planning can anticipate. That training and discipline matter because when everything is chaos, training is what soldiers fall back on. And that luck, pure chance, plays a bigger role in combat than anyone wants to admit. The howitzers, facing the right direction by accident. The bulldozer completing buns on guns 4, 5, and 6 before dark. Gun Sergeant Franklin taking that firing pin. Small things, random things. Things that saved lives. Before we finish this story, I want you to understand why we tell these stories at Vietnam War Records. It's not about glorifying war. War is terrible. It destroys people. It should be avoided whenever possible. We tell these stories because they're true and because the men who lived them deserve to be remembered accurately. Not as cardboard heroes, not as victims, but as real people who faced extraordinary circumstances. The soldiers at Coral made mistakes. They felt fear. Some of them broke under the strain. That's human. But they also showed incredible. They kept fighting when everything said to quit. They looked after their mates. They did their duty. And that matters. It matters because we live in freedom, because people were willing to stand in dangerous places and hold the line. Whether the Vietnam War was the right war to fight is debatable, but the men, they answered their country's call. They did hard things in hard places, and some of them never came home. So if this story meant something to you, if you learned something, if you felt something, hit that subscribe button right now for Vietnam War Records. Turn on notifications. Share this video. We're bringing you the untold battles, the real tactics, the stories that matter from the Vietnam War. Stories like this one don't get told on mainstream channels. They require research, respect, and a commitment to truth. That's what we do. Help us keep doing it. Subscribe. Comment below if you have questions or if you want us to cover a particular battle or unit. We read every comment. We listen to our community. And we'll keep bringing you these stories as long as you want to hear them. The final thing to say about Fire Support Base Coral is this. In the end, after all the analysis and all the lessons learned, what mattered most was that Australian soldiers refused to lose. They were outnumbered, underprepared, caught by surprise in the darkness by an enemy they'd been told wasn't there. They should have been overrun. The textbook said they should have broken, but they didn't. They fought with what they had where they were, and they won. Not perfectly, not without cost, but they won. That's the story. That's what happened on the night of May 12th to 13th, 1968. That's how First RA stopped the NVA while still digging their trenches. Remember their names, remember their courage, and remember that freedom isn't free. Someone always pays the price. At Coral, 11 Australian soldiers paid that price. They gave tomorrow for our today. We owe them the truth. And we owe them this promise that we will never forget. Thank you for watching Vietnam War Records. Subscribe now, and we'll see you in the next one.